There are many names for God that people can use. Some might call it source. Scientists sometimes use names like the old one. I think Einstein did. And so I don't like to use the word God because it has such a strong religious connotation that people think they know what you're talking about, or they will cast it into one particular religion or another. I like to think of it more as there's some kind of a universal consciousness, which may simply be awareness without anything else, but on a universal scale, or it may have some intelligence to it, or may have some intention to it. It may have things which we experience but blown up to a universal scale. That's going to look a lot like, I think actually it'll look a lot bigger than what many people think about in terms of a personal God. Much bigger, beyond our conception bigger. The notion of intelligence way beyond what I can imagine, or way beyond what humanity can imagine, that kind of does make sense to me. And it's partially because I've come around to this notion that I think that there probably is some kind of primordial consciousness, that human consciousness is not the end all of it, it's just a little tiny piece of it. That would suggest that maybe what we see in many religions about we're made in the image of God. Well, I would interpret that as we have capacities that are like that to a very limited extent. Well, so I have capacities of being able to direct my attention. I have memories. I have a certain degree of figuring out things, the rationality and so on. If that on a very large scale, universal scale, would be beyond our ability to actually imagine what that's like.
Consciousness, I think, is another name for what St. Augustine might have called knowing. Not knowing intellectually, but knowing in a deep way. And now science has just better unraveled the structures of knowing in the levels of consciousness. In that respect, I think we can say God is absolute consciousness, absolute knowing. So I think consciousness and mystery are coming more and more together, and certainly quantum physics becomes much more like spirituality sometimes than hard science, because it simply can't quite come out with a conclusion that can be experimentally retried 1,000 times and verified. There's always just speculation and observations. I think science and religion, they need to be brought together, and I think consciousness may be the bridge that brings them together.
There was an author back in the 1850s who wrote a little booklet or pamphlet called Flatlanders, and it was his attempt to try to explain to people how a person who lived in a two-dimensional universe would not be able to understand a three-dimensional universe, as a way of helping us to understand how we can't understand. First of all, it's most amazing to me that we can conceive of something that we could never prove. That's amazing. That's something divine about that. It suggests a connection to something far greater than ourselves, even if we may never be able to glimpse it or describe it or anything. But it is a known unknowable. And isn't that what God is? Sort of, faith says that it's known, So God is the known unknowable.
God is it's a big word. A lot of people are trying to run away from the word, but I just don't think you can escape it, because it captures a lot of the richness and context of our relationship to creation, and particularly referring to an infinite God. Because infinity is an ineffable concept. Mathematicians and physicists think they know what infinity is. They play with it all the time. Georg Cantor was a famous mathematician in the 19th century, and he proved that there are infinities of different sizes. And these infinities actually have a kind of an arithmetic. Well, does that mean we actually grasped what infinity is? No.
We can't get our heads around it, right? So you can't logically explain infinity or the eternal. You have to either surrender to it, you believe it, in other words, you cross the gap of logic into faith, because there's something about life that is ever deepening.
No mathematician and no computer will ever count to infinity. And no physicist will ever see infinity. Matter of fact, I feel that one of the things that creates a sense of awe and mystery in human beings is being in a place where you have an immense visual field, like the horizon of an ocean or mountainscapes off in the distance, where the visual acuity that you have in your eyeball and your brain is not capable of distinguishing the detail. So you are face to face with infinity. You can't perceive the detail, it looks infinite. And that brings on that sense of awe and sense of wonder. So an infinite God is, in a sense, ineffable, unreachable, but at the same time carries with it that sense of awe and beauty and joy and love flowing through the universe, giving us the gift of life. And here we are. And I consider our purpose, the purpose of our being here, is ultimately to gain consciousness and gain wisdom and gain intelligence, and then gain the realization that our purpose is to be able to commune, loving communion with people, with life, with creation, and ultimately with its creator. And that's a reciprocal relationship.
A knowing and a knower are what the universe and what the cosmotheandric whole is, God and cosmos together.
If God is completely all-encompassing, there's no space where God isn't, then we live within the divine at every moment.
Philosophers for endless ages, even those who didn't believe anything, would ask, why something and not nothing? Science, for all that is achieved, cannot explain the sheer existence of existence itself. So I think God at the heart of life, shorthand of saying it, is, I think, no God, no life. God is the power of life.
And I think that's a beautiful notion that really nobody can complain about. It doesn't come with dogmas. It doesn't force you into one sacred book. It doesn't have you being, the one whom God has spoken to or through. Because I have to say, you and you and you are as much divine as I am. And when the divine becomes sort of like the warm water, the amniotic fluid that fills the wound, and that we know ourselves as being held and embraced by this all-encompassing presence. To me, that's a notion of God worth talking about.
The name God points to that absolute awareness of all that is. The Hindus have this kind of notion as well in the Atman and the Brahman. And so I think this notion of consciousness as the heart of life is really what's at the heart of all mysticism.
My personal belief is that the whole comes before the parts. That what is most fundamental is the whole of physical systems, the whole which is an organism, the whole of a society, and it's a big step, but the whole of all reality. Again, what the Hindus call Brahman. The whole is the water in which we swim. The whole is that thing that gives us identity. The whole is beyond reason. It's beyond analogy with any of the sciences, which obviously have to take a portion of empirical reality to study. And it's beyond even the knowledge of the philosopher.
And I think the name God can sometimes be misleading. God is like this super grandfatherly figure, paternal, that's hovering over us in heaven and watching bad things happen to good people. And that is such an erroneous, such a misguided, absolutely, completely contrived notion of God that has really nothing to do with God.
What if God, instead of being the white guy with a beard, what if God is another name for that whole of all things? And in my belief, whatever the individual is, comes from her place within the whole. And whatever she returns to is that whole.
I'm not a very religious person, so I think the idea of a personal God, an entity that is looking out for me, doesn't make any sense.
What if God is understood as impersonal? Like as in pantheism, all is one and there's no personal categories. Then what's interesting about that, then God isn't more than we are. God is less than we are because we're conscious of the universe and God is this kind of underlying force. So that leads me to think, I prefer to say the divine, but you can say God if you want. The divine is more than personal. They would say personal and also more than personal. Has wishes and is more than any volitional being. Has power, but power in a way we can never understand. There is both the God who is all-enveloping, that infinite ground of everything that exists, and I call that the divine. And then there's also a personal dimension, something so far beyond us, but at least including that which we are.
We are unique in being sentient, in being self-aware, and I think that, for me, is not only what distinguishes us from the rest of creation, but the thing that connects us with God. We have an animal nature, and then we have something that calls us beyond that, something that calls us at our best to make decisions that have a greater benefit. I guess the most extreme of that is the decision to lay down our lives for somebody else. So what is it that calls against our nature to do this? And so it has something to do with the mind. It's also an indicator of the soul, I think. And that's where faith comes in. None of us is promised to live forever. None of us is promised to have all of our desires met. And so there's uncertainty about that. But if we're living our lives with the intention of doing as little damage as possible, of being open to as much joy and wonder as possible, of leaving as light a footprint as possible, and maybe being remembered kindly, that's a great place to root your faith.
I think God it's really simple. I have loved you with an everlasting love. If you find yourself in my love, you will find yourself. And if you find yourself, you will find the world. And then you just participate in that world and just become in it. It's meant for everyone. God is big enough for everyone and for everything. And actually becoming more good, believe it or not. And I think that that goodness rising up in life is the power of God. I think without God, we would have no hope. That breath of God is always the future. God is not just in the now, God is the future. God is the ever fullness of love. And we never can exhaust the possibilities of life because God is God. God is always that overflowing love, that ever-expanding field of love before us. If you find God, you found everything. You found what you're supposed to be. And that's why I think when we talk about God at the heart of life, we're not talking about like some big being who's sort of helping us by. We're talking about divine love poured out into the very beingness of our lives. Like our existence is a being in love. We are being loved and created every moment.